Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. There is this statistic that I keep seeing, a theory, I guess, that I keep seeing cited, which I find really amusing, but also kind of telling. On the No Kings website, if you scroll down to what's next in the fight, they say, we're inspired by the 3.5% principle. It only takes 3.5% of the population engaging in sustained strategic protest against authoritarianism to achieve significant political change. Am I missing something? Or is that basically saying, like, hey guys, we really can stage a Bolshevik revolution? Like, that's just like, it's a funny thing to say at a No Kings protest that, like, it only takes 3.5% of the population to overturn a duly elected president.
Right, and I mean, the irony is, okay, if we had some, like, dictatorial, iron-fisted king, do you think he would put up with that?
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Klavan, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and monarchic, kingly editor of the American Mind. So far, the protests haven't kicked me out of my authoritarian, dictatorial role here at TAM. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Our actual king, publisher, and president, Ryan Williams, is out on vacation, some very well-earned summer vacation this week. And that means we are going it alone, doing it live here with Mike Sabo, managing editor. Mike, welcome to our first ever two-man pod. Seth and I used to do this back in the day, but this is our first time trying it out.
Those were honestly some of probably my favorite episodes, so I'm really looking forward to it.
I know, dude. I really liked those the Klavan and Barron episodes too. So the Klavan and Sabo show is going to be fun, I bet. It's a funny week for it to be happening, honestly, because summer's always a kind of skeleton crew type time. We've got all sorts of stuff that we do here at Claremont during the summers, like the fellowships and a variety of other programming events and things. So we often have these slightly lighter podcasts, but that usually goes along with a kind of lighter or silly season in the news. Like usually there's not that much going on. And so maybe we do some more cultural matters, or we talk about like big picture political philosophy. This week, not so much. We have had probably one of the most eventful week-long periods between episodes in the history of this podcast since the last time we all sat down to talk. And so it really was a time when we thought, like, gosh, it would be great to have the whole crew here together. And so I'm going to just begin by making all of the typical disclaimers when we have a lot of breaking news going on, and they apply probably exponentially this time around. First of all, neither of us speaks for the Claremont Institute generally. We are going to revisit probably all of these topics when Ryan comes back next week. You are getting the raw, unfiltered, kind of first blush reaction from me and Mike personally, and nobody else at Claremont is implicated or incriminated by what we are about to say. Also, we record this at a lag, so we're doing this episode several days probably before you will hear it. And all of these stories, especially the first one that we're going to start off with, which is, of course, the conflict between Israel and Iran, war in the Middle East, all of that is going to have developed by the time you hear this. So I will give you what I take to be the latest as of right now, and we will kind of discuss some of what might go on and what might happen. Which hopefully will have in itself some interest and relevance at our kind of like larger, higher order reflections. But bear in mind that we may get stuff wrong, or there may be things that kind of unfold as we go. And on top of all that, foreign policy, international relations, I don't think either of us is like feeling like we're completely on our like in our area of expertise or in our wheelhouse here at all. So like we will also be talking in the weeks to come to some people that are actual experts on this. But on the other hand, part of the fun of the podcast is you can just do it live, talk on the fly, and we will kind of see how things develop. So let me set the stage here to the extent that I can. I think probably most of our listeners are familiar at this point with the broad brush strokes of what transpired over the end of last week and the weekend. In many ways, this is something that has been brewing for years and years. But the actual sequence of events that unfolded happened very, very quickly, at least so far as I could tell. Obviously, Israel and Iran have been in a state of antipathy toward one another for, decades. As long as we've been alive, there's no way to kind of go back to the origin of this conflict. But perhaps the best place to start is with this kind of like 60-day deadline that Trump had given to Iran for a deal on curbing its nuclear program. This is the kind of underlying major situation here is the enrichment of uranium to weapons grade purity, which is something that both Israel and the United States are extremely uncomfortable with the thought of this kind of insane Islamist regime having weapons grade uranium. There have been deals and talks and counter negotiations going on, again, forever, but this was this deadline that hit just recently and that Iran blew past. And so one of the kind of immediate questions in the fog of war was whether or not, to what extent Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, president of Israel, had kind of gotten together to talk about what Israel would do if these negotiations broke down, and to what extent Bibi kind of took things into his own hands and Israel acted alone. The official narrative that's now developing seems to be that Trump was aware of but did not participate in the Israeli plan to strike Iran, which it then did with astonishing precision. One of the things that I'm hoping we'll get into talking about is the way in which warfare generally between this and the pager strike that Israel pulled off recently and the Ukrainian drone strike against Russia is really kind of remaking modern warfare in real time. We're sort of watching a lot of technological developments that will have knock-on effects, but we're also watching a specific conflict which has already unfolded dramatically. So the Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, is still alive, but many other top officials were taken out. Iran's nuclear capacity has not been completely destroyed, but they've been severely weakened in that sense. It seems as if there's basically total flyover control of Iran's airspace on the part of Israel and its allies. So this has been an embarrassment for the regime. And one of the questions, the Iranian regime that is, and one of the questions at stake is whether Netanyahu wants to push all the way toward regime change and to see the Islamic Republic overthrown and a new regime installed, or whether this is really just about making sure that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Netanyahu has not ruled out regime change, but it seems like getting these enrichment facilities totally incapacitated is the most above board and straightforward goal of these operations. To do that fully, it would seem that Israel will need American buy-in to an extent because only America is capable of fielding what's called the bunker busters that could take out finally Iran's most deeply buried nuclear facilities. And so there's also been talk about the extent to which America might get involved. This in turn implicates all sorts of questions about isolationism versus the foreign wars and bad memories of intervention in the Middle East and so on and so forth. Has been part of the capital D discourse on X. But I've already been talking too long. Mike, what have I missed? What's been your sort of experience of the last few days, and where do you think we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's a lot to sort out. I am, kind of an amateur foreign policy analyst. Took a class in grad school at Hillsdale, so obviously a good place, but obviously one class is nowhere near enough to have any kind of like definitive take on this. I'm like you, I've just been reading, what's being put out there in Axios, New York Times, and etc. And yeah, I mean, it looks like to me, with what Trump has been saying, he just tweeted out, it was actually a Truth Untruth Social, and then he put it out on his Twitter account, basically unconditional surrender. He was talking to Iran with that. He was talking about the Ayatollah. He said he's an easy target, but is safe. We're not going to take him out, kill him, at least not for now. So that's something that I think Netanyahu has wanted to do in the past. Trump has declined that. There are just so many moving pieces, moving parts. Just yesterday, it was reported, Iran's been urgently signaling that they want to end hostilities and resume the talks that Trump's envoy has been having there, that I think even our own Michael Anton, I think, was part of in some shape, way, or form. Now it seems like, especially with tankers and all kind of refueling planes, and it looks like that we have at least 3 U.S. Navy destroyers entering the Mediterranean. There's a second U.S. carrier strike group is heading toward the Arabian Sea. So, Pete Hegseth says, hey, this is just defensive. We're just kind of, making sure that nothing happens to U.S. interests, to U.S. personnel. We'll see. Obviously, they're putting things in place for possibly an offensive strike too, as well. I don't think you cannot discount that at all. I just saw posted a New York Times story, just put up, 12:15 today. Maggie Haberman's one of them, so she's been following Trump obviously for a long, long time. And again, New York Times, take this with a grain of salt, but I'll just kind of read at least the first few kind of opening paragraphs. By the end of last month, American spy agencies monitoring Israel's military activities and discussions among the country's political leadership had come to a striking conclusion. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is planning for an imminent attack on Iran's nuclear program, with or without the participation of the United States. Mr. Netanyahu had spent more than a decade warning that an overwhelming military assault was necessary before Iran reached the point that it could quickly build a nuclear weapon. Yet he had always backed down after multiple American presidents, fearful of the consequences of another conflagration in the Middle East, told him that the United States would not assist in an attack. But this time, the American intelligence assessment was that Mr. Netanyahu is preparing not just a limited strike on the nuclear facilities, but a far more expansive attack that could imperil the Iranian regime itself, and that he was prepared to go it alone. The intelligence left President Trump facing difficult choices. He had become invested in diplomatic push to persuade Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions, and had already swatted down one attempt by Mr. Netanyahu in April to convince him that the time was right for a military assault on Iran. During a strained phone call in late May, Mr. Trump again warned the Israeli leader against a unilateral attack that would short-circuit the diplomacy. But over the last several weeks, it became increasingly apparent to Trump administration officials that they might not be able to stop Mr. Netanyahu this time, according to interviews with key players in the administration's deliberations over how to respond, and others familiar with their thinking. At the same time, Mr. Trump was getting impatient with Iran over the slow pace of negotiations and beginning to conclude that the talks might go nowhere. So that kind of is a fascinating thing to know kind of what's going on behind the scenes as things are shifting. Trump, I think, is kind of reassessing things. I know obviously with the right, I mean, being anti kind of regime change is obviously a big thing. So Rob Murray, I think over at Unheard had a good, obviously being from Iran himself, growing up there. I mean, kind of had a really good kind of insider's account kind of on what that would mean. And what that would mean if, say, Iran went the way of other countries, of Libya, say, if there was that vacuum there. And that would, I think, be pretty disastrous overall. I don't think we would quite want to see that. Could it go to pre-1979? Iran, I think, has a history of monarchy. Could that happen? I don't know. He says he seemed to think that, opinions are split inside Iran over what exactly, would take the place of, the ruling powers there currently. But this is just such, I think, a big deal. This is just things, people are going to be talking about for a long, long time. I mean, I was even on X, last night. I think it was, last night or the night before, where it just seemed like almost open war was just absolutely imminent. And that's one thing, too, I've noticed in this whole conversation is this kind of going to just like panic and outright people being maybe possibly a little bit hysterical about this. And I can understand why. I mean, this is serious. Possibilities of regime change, especially with what we just went through with 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I get that. But, I am definitely seeing that kind of thing. People turning on the president right and left. And I know that there are problems too with this kind of viewpoint too. But, I'm kind of a trust the plan guy until Trump really does something that I think is highly problematic. I'm gonna say, look, I know some of the people he has in his administration, very sober, very learned. Until something big happens, I really hope that it is just defensive, that we don't really get more involved, because I think we're already helping out the Israelis, I think, with intelligence and some other things too. Just like I think what we were doing, in the war in Ukraine and their war versus Russia. But it's just there's so many moving pieces. We'll kind of see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, people are, to your point about hysteria, people are traumatized by the failures of the Iraq War. I
No
think
doubt.
it's fair to say, especially many prominent commentators on the right served a tour or more in that
Hmm.
war, or another one of America's wars in the Middle East. And there is, in my assessment, there's a lot of kind of like, and I'm using it metaphorically, but there's like PTSD from some of the mistakes and failures of the Bush administration in its response to 9/11, especially several years on, and all this graveyard of empires stuff. And I understand that feeling. I did not serve in that war, and so I have a degree of a measure of sort of respect for the perspective of people who did and feel that that was misbegotten venture in which Americans were tasked to die for, as we've discussed before in this podcast, a really poorly defined notion of regime change. And so I think a lot of that is motivating people's sense that when you start to get into these talks of like, we're going to the Middle East and we're going to overturn the Islamic Republic and we're going to bring back the time when, women walked free on the streets of Tehran, especially in the conditions created by social media, people then leap to like, I'm not dying for Israel. I mean, that's like a meme that you really see right now.
Oh, I see that all over the place. And yeah, usually there's another word put in there too.
Exactly. And I just think, like, I mean, everyone who listens to this podcast knows my extreme distaste for the new anti Semites of the right. So it should be obvious that to me strikes me, not just because I think anti Semitism is itself poisonous, but I also think it makes you stupid. And one way in which it makes you stupid is it creates these sort of like automatic Pavlovian response pathways in your brain so that you leap instantly to like, it's the Jews that are making, And so I don't want to minimize entirely the truth of the Afghanistan retrospectives, especially from people who fought in that war. But I do think that there is a fair amount of highly improbable disaster catastrophizing that's emerging out of that, some of which is motivated by this anti-Semitism stuff, and some of which is motivated by a more serious reappraisal of America's like role on the world stage. But none of it seems to me to particularly delineate likely outcomes or scenarios here. Like, I just don't think we're putting boots on the ground in Iran. That's like not where this seems to be going. It does seem like America is going to commit a ton of resources to helping Israel bring this to a swift and effective conclusion. And I actually think, again, like very provisional and totally speaking off the cuff here, just for myself, like given where things currently stand, that seems like a smart move. Like America probably should help to disarm Iran at a nuclear level, leaving the regime change thing aside and just talking about the more immediate issue, which is like, how does everybody get to a point where this is over? It seems like the kind of full and final decisive humiliation of the Iranian regime and its nuclear ambitions would be a good thing. Now, it does also seem as if there is a way in which these things tend to go. Like, this is not sort of first time that, well, it's the first time that actual strikes have ensued after this kind of back and forth, but it's not the first time, for instance, that like Iran has retaliated against Israel as it has done, like in order to save face, and then basically backed down. And I think like the thing we might all hope for is that like this gets diffused in that kind of short, sharp shock sort of way. But the larger issue is like, what does this portend? I feel, and two things again off the bat that seem true is one, it portends like a radically different kind of warfare going forward for the world. Like these highly technologized precision strikes that we're seeing, both in the kind of much more ad hoc, pasted together Ukrainian efforts against Russia, but also in these like top tier Israeli actions. I just mean that like whatever happens in the future, like if China is involved, if like whatever conflicts America is facing in the future, our technological capacities and our defense against covert precision strikes are going to have to be dramatically beefed up. Like I think that that's actually why Trump was kind of onto something back in his speech. And was it January when he called for the Golden Dome, like to match Israel's defense
Mm-hmm.
system that it has?
Yep.
That sort of thing strikes me as like a much more sober and serious conversation rather than, and this is what I'm worried about, like relitigating our past mistakes in this present moment, which is something that people do all the time, myself included. And my typical model for thinking about this is always when we do these two-man podcasts, we always get into like the weird niche history sections. But like my typical model for this is always Greece's reaction to the Persian War when the Peloponnesian War came up. And like you had this one kind of conflict, which was a united Greek front led by Sparta and Athens against this giant encroaching assault from Persia. And that went so great. And all the generation that like lived through that basically just became the greatest generation and talked about that war as if it were the be all and end all. And then we're totally unsuited to analyze the radically different scenario that obtained, like when those military alliances of Greeks were themselves the thing that were like folding in upon themselves and collapsing into conflict. All of this simply to say, like, treating this situation as if what's going to happen is the template of our past mistakes in Afghanistan is going to be like cookie cutter cut and pasted into this moment seems like a recipe for poor thought and emotional reaction. But that's just me.
No, I think there's a lot to that because you see, especially on the new right, and I think for good reason, there's been talk for in years past about, the World War II, the post-war consensus. We view, every bad guy is Hitler.
Excellent example.
This is that. So it's like now I think what we've done is, and honestly, I was blind to this until very recently, but the idea is we view now every possible war through the lens of Iraq. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's going to end the exact same way. And maybe in principle it will. I mean, again, like going back to, so Rob Murray's essay in Unheard. I mean, I don't think, a country that large with that kind of population, no political leadership to speak of. I don't think that's going to end actually very well. And Iran is a completely different country than Iraq. That was kind of cobbled together with a bunch of kind of different tribes and peoples. I mean, Iran has, I think, been much more of a country that is much more unified historically and has been, much more of a people that has thought of themselves as unified. So
can I just ask you a question? Sorry, because I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Is this
sure?
Is the issue here like, let's imagine that BB and Trump do want to push for regime change? Like the big unanswered question is, what is the successor regime? Like not just toppling these other guys. Okay, so
that's exactly right.
It's a decent question.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, really important question. I mean, we're seeing in some of these regimes where, tyrants, dictators have been overturned. And then you see Libya. I mean, what's going on there right now? What's going on in some other countries where this has happened just very recently? And the results have not been good, to say the least. There was actually an administration official says, the Ayatollah I know is better than the Ayatollah I don't know. and there's something to that, right? I mean, you know what you think, the grass is greener on the other side. And then all of a sudden you get to it and you'll find bombs kind of just raining down on you 24/7 and just utter chaos and civil strife all over the place.
This, like, up to a certain point, right? I mean, certainly we have been burned before when it comes to like, won't it be great when we topple this evil dictator? And then it turns out that the only thing left to replace him is something even worse or less predictable and more chaotic. And so I genuinely have no idea, just not really having a firm grasp of the situation in Iran, like what the most likely successor regime would be. I mean, don't they have a king who's like in exile or something?
I think that's right. And they certainly have a history of monarchy. I think the question is now, though, especially with the current regime that's still in power, although I think weakened somewhat, especially in recent years. It's been in power since what, 1979? That are they going to go back to what Iran's been historically, or has this new regime kind of ingrained itself within the people? Has it become a tradition where, you have different factions, you have different people who are kind of, want, a kingship, want monarchy, or want more of a, I guess, like a theocratic government, if that's the right word, of the way that, Iran is now? I think that's actually an open question in a way where if this would have happened, say, 30, 40 years ago, I think the answer would have been very clear.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we are, as we sort of wander tentatively about in this fog of war, we're gravitating toward like we're probably not heading for Afghanistan redux. So calm down a little bit. And bad for Iran under the Ayatollah to have nuclear weapons. So let's not have that happen, but also be very sure that you know exactly what you're doing if you engage in regime change. So like yes to nuclear incapacitation, very hot under the collar when it comes to regime change. And maybe if our listeners know about like what the possible scenarios are in Iran absent the Ayatollah, like what are the alternatives? We would be very interested to hear from you.
I totally agree. And I think another lesson is, and I've seen this with a lot of Trump voters online. It's like, oh, we don't want intervention. But then they say intervention as like, it's such kind of almost a hard line and something in principle that's so hardened. It's like, okay, I mean, Trump always said that he didn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Look back at his first administration, bunker buster bombs that they used in Iraq, assassinations, I mean, all kind of stuff. And none of that, actually led to some, World War III, some great kind of conflagration. So, there is an argument to be made there too that Trump isn't quite the, I don't know why he's termed, I guess, or some people's administration is, isolationist. I mean, that's not at all how he governed during his first term. And I'm not surprised that that's not how he's governing in his second term. I think if the red line is crossed, boots on the ground, we have declared open war in Iran. I think that I could see where people would get off the bus and be angered by that. But those are steps that were not taken in the first administration. But I will also say, look, this is the president who you voted for, so don't be surprised when he does the same things that he did in the first administration.
Yeah, there's a site the White House put out a list of Trump's statements on this topic, and they did bring a ton of receipts. To your point, that Trump has basically always, anytime he mentions Iran, he says they can't have nukes. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes he does that Trumpian thing where he's like, "Oh, I think we can talk to them, but they can't have," but he does always like affix, but they can't have nukes. And I think what you say about like this bright line conception of like, are we going to get involved, is a very good point, and also something that is only exacerbated by this technological stuff. Is it's like we picture this as, well, are we going to like formally march on Tehran, or are we going to stay well out of it? And America, for a very long time, has had many, many different gradations of involvement in between those two things, and it seems very likely that our involvement is and will continue to be like much more in the indirect vein, unless between now and the time people listen to this, something dramatic happens. Okay, we I think have talked around this subject enough, and we managed to get out of it, so far as I can tell, without saying anything terribly incriminating. So I think, Mike, we should quit while we're ahead.
I totally agree.
Put that subject well in the rearview mirror. All right, wiping the sweat off my brow. Let's talk about the libs. They're always more fun to talk about.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, great. So they did a protest, I guess. This is a funny experience because we often have occasion to refer to Scott Adams's concept of watching two different movies, that Red America and Blue America are just like living in completely separate realities. This has become particularly acute ever since the legacy press so thoroughly discredited itself during the lead up to the 2024 election. I mean, there's technological elements to this too, where X and other platforms have made it impossible for NBC and ABC to have a monopoly like they used to. But also, all those people were so in the tank for Biden as he deteriorated that they have lost what used to be their stranglehold on the official narrative. And now people really are like people who watch ABC and believe in what Joy Reid says and all of that, like are really living in an alternate reality from you and me and the people who listen to this podcast. Like I spent the weekend. My parents were in town. They were in Nashville for my dad was on business, and my mom came, which is always like a wonderful time. And we went to brunch at their hotel, and we like walked around Nashville. And my dad and I had a cigar, and it's like we had this completely pleasant, like domestic family weekend in a major American city. And then I opened up X because I never go on Sundays. And I just opened it up on Monday and I was like, oh, right. Like there's an entire segment of the population for whom Saturday was like this cataclysmic moment of rebellion against a king, against the monarchic, autocratic, tyrannical dictator Donald Trump. This was the No Kings protest, which is really funny. I mean, my dad said to me, he was like, this is sort of akin to like having a no unicorns protest. Like
Yeah, right.
Chris Rufo had this great piece in City Journal. I think it was today or it came out fairly recently, to the effect that the whole premise is absurd because not only is Trump not a king, he doesn't even have the full powers of the presidency. Like the courts are holding him up,
Right.
And so there's this like total fiction that Trump has attained some level of like constitutional overreach that makes it necessary now. And I think this is kind of dovetails with the ICE protests that we talked about last time, the riots that happened in LA, that like this is, if we don't stand up now, then we may never have another chance again. So there's this big protest planned for the 14th, which did in fact happen. Much has been made of like how many people came out. I think like if you weren't directly involved, you might have blinked and missed this. But there are some sort of interesting dimensions of it. So this is basically like Resistance 2.0, which we've been talking about wanting to see for some time, or like wondering about for some time. Not so much wanting to see it, but on this podcast we often say like the resistance last time was so prominent, and now it seems a bit flaccid. What's going on? And I would say that again, this feels kind of astroturfed to me. It feels a little bit like trying so hard to make fetch a thing, but fetch is just not really a thing. There is this statistic that I keep seeing, a theory, I guess, that I keep seeing cited, which I find really amusing, but also kind of telling. On the No Kings website, if you scroll down to what's next in the fight, they say we're inspired by the 3.5% principle. It only takes 3.5% of the population engaging in sustained strategic protest against authoritarianism to achieve significant political change. Am I missing something? Or is that basically saying, like, hey guys, we really can stage a Bolshevik revolution? Like, that's just like, it's a funny thing to say at a No Kings protest that, like, it only takes 3.5% of the population to overturn a duly elected president.
Right. And I mean, the irony is, okay, if we had some like dictatorial, iron fisted king, do you think he would put up with that? Do you think he would just let that, like, website just, there? And no, absolutely not. He would absolutely crush these people.
The
So,
Islamic Republic of Iran is not known for its no Islamists
no,
protests, right?
no, liberty is not something you'll find, I think, in large part of the public areas there in Iran. Yeah, like you said, I mean, this is just the height of silliness. Like the idea that Trump, who every time the guy does something is handcuffed by a judge somewhere, and, nationwide injunction. I mean, this idea that he's just doing whatever he wants is just the height of foolishness. Like these people have, I don't know what grade, TDS now, but it's just off the charts. It's just absolutely foolish. And the idea too, like, don't these people realize, like, I mean, the president itself, the model is actually based on, I mean, partially like kingly powers of what they saw, in the monarchy in Great Britain, like the
This
royal,
is sort of the monarchic element in
right? Like, I mean, the powers of veto and pardon, those were royal powers in England. So, I mean, it's like, okay, look, you can't have it both ways. You can't like absolutely decry it, when it's Trump, and then love it when, Joe Biden vetoed something or, issued a pardon or whatever. It's like, look, that's just a power just inherent in the office itself that every president has had. If you really look at even like the revolution, I mean, yes, okay, you have Jefferson warring against the king, obviously, in the Declaration, especially the parts that were excised about, him basically being behind the slave trade and everything like that. And I get that. And that's very true. But I mean, really, they were asking the king for reconciliation really against Parliament. Like that was even more the problem, I think, in a lot of the revolutionaries' minds. So it's just kind of funny. I mean, it's like, you like a king, when he's with you, and then you don't like him when he's not with you. I mean, that's what this is all about at the end of the day.
Okay,
It's
this
like,
is
I
super
just don't like
interesting.
Trump.
This is funny because, like, on the one hand, I feel that you're being exceptionally generous intellectually by engaging at this level with the
I
purely
am.
political
I
philosophy
am.
of these guys. But like,
Yeah.
just I will totally go with you for a bit. And like, there is, the kernel of truth to which this totally deranged narrative is reacting is that, as we've discussed many times on this show, there is a sort of standoff, I would say, in progress, not even brewing, between the executive and the judicial power, right? Which has been long in the making and is like very much of a piece with everything we talk about the bureaucratization of our system and so on and so forth. And it's also the case in ways that make me a little bit nervous that Trump does this thing where he will go for 200% on the assumption that he'll be walked back by his negotiating partner to 100%. And so on the one hand, that's not precisely how I would like to see presidents operate. Like I wish that we had statesmen who thought like, well, these are the limits of my power and I will go up to them but no further.
Somebody like a Grover Cleveland, who is, I mean, the last, I think, real last president who was worried about the Constitution with every action that he took.
Totally. And I loved him on Sesame Street, which is a different thing. But no, I mean, this is like
Right.
also true, right? But you make exactly the point that I had in mind next, which is like, yes, I would love if that were the situation. But it's not Trump who introduced the reality that that's not how politics operates, right? Like the
Exactly.
things that Trump does that make us antsy are things that like are basically like accepting the tactics of the modern presidency, right? Like when
Hmm.
Joe Biden said that he was just going to wait for the courts to overturn his totally unconstitutional student loan forgiveness, right? Like that's the kind of headbutting that Democrat presidents are expected to engage in. And of course, the permanent state of emergency is like a very important part of this. So it seems to me completely absurd to say that Trump has kingly ambitions. It's certainly true that like we need a serious recalibration of the distribution of power within our system. But in order for there to be disarmament on the part of the executive in that recalibration, you do also need the other two branches to behave in a way that like can counterbalance one another, which would mean Congress taking up a lot more power and asserting itself a lot more, and probably judges conceding that they're limited in ways that they have not conceded for many generations. So
And I think the key, as you point out, is Congress legislating. I mean, you look at the Federalist and what was James Madison concerned with above all, it was the legislative vortex, I think as he called it, where it just assumes more and more and more power. And he just thought that the ambition of the legislators, like that is just ingrained within that institution because it's ingrained in human nature. I mean, the fact that now they've basically, put off all responsibility, and when anything bad happens, say, well, those were rules, in the bureaucracy or the departments or whatever agencies. We don't really have any control over that. So it's like, how do you, jumpstart and reignite ambition in the legislature? I can't, that's a very, very big problem. I'm not sure how you do that. Obviously getting better people into office and so forth. But I mean, the legislature is just, that's the key to kind of getting to returning to constitutional government in any really big and profound way. I think Trump is doing what he can in paring back the administrative state a little bit. Obviously, he did that in his first term with some of the rules, where I think it was like every rule that was done, I think 3 were taken out, if I remember correctly.
That is a really cool. Yeah, I like that idea a lot.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, Congress, that's the key. But just going back to the main question, I mean, the idea that, no kings and that, and it's interesting too, actually. Dan McCarthy over Modern Age had a really good observation where it's like, what happened to kind of the Bernie Sanders, like, how about anti, oligarchy? What happened to that? That's interesting that it's shifted from that to no kings.
Yeah, they tried to make that happen with the tech bros, right? It's the broligarchy for a while,
Hmm.
but that's just really not going to fly for so many reasons. I mean, anytime politicians open their mouths about tech and tech bros, they completely beclown themselves. Like they just senator, like our
Every
legislators
time.
just do not understand what the heck is going on in Silicon Valley, what anybody wants, what they believe. Like it is really embarrassing whenever they have like Mark Zuckerberg out to a hearing. So that's kind of fallen apart. The congressional part of it is also really interesting to me because this is just one of those issues where whichever way you turn, you kind of butt up against the inescapable need in a republic for like freely chosen individual virtue, right? For there to be like persons who sort of undertake or are schooled and trained in the virtues of civic responsibility. And this is one area where, and I don't think this is his job, so I'm not faulting him for this exactly, but like, I don't think Trump is really good for that. Like, I think that we're probably not going to see a resurgence of legislative initiative and virtue until after the era of Trump. And
Hmm.
each era has its own tasks and challenges. And I'm not saying that like we need Trump to like change what he's doing somehow to like fix this exactly, but I do think that because Trump is such a loyalty guy and because like the MAGA movement has always had this like it's not the core of the movement the way that critics say it is, but it has always had this sort of gravity well of hackery and sycophancy, right? And it's conducive to that, and it makes it difficult for people to genuinely take a legislative stand without compromising their electoral career because Trump has so much charisma, so much power. Like you can get away with it if you're Rand Paul, but you're also not probably gonna achieve a lot like that way.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great observation. Like, this is not the age, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. This is not the age where you're going to have a resurgence, of congressional power. I think, Trump is working with the cards he was dealt. I mean, we basically live in, a time where Congress has abdicated their power. You have the judiciary kind of trying to, butt in, and then you have an executive who, okay, is an executive in some way, shape, or form. But I mean, ever since, I'd say, Humphrey's executor 1935, I mean, he's really been only maybe half in control of his, own department. So, I mean, that's kind of where we're at. But then with Trump, I think I heard one of my grad school professors talk about this. I mean, it's like, what he's really trying to do is, I mean, people say, well, he's trying to return to the 1950s kind of Republicans like Robert Taft or whatever, no war and everything like that, anti interventionism. And like I said previously, I don't particularly buy that. But, he's still trying, he's working within, the, Wilsonian kind of vision of the president. He sets the vision, all these kind of like progressive, kind of third rate Hegelian terms that he learned from, his poor reading of Hegel and other German philosophers. Yeah, if you ever want to just, if you ever need to go to sleep, read Woodrow Wilson on some of those subjects, and
Uh,
you'll be gone in like 2 seconds. So again, that's just the what Trump is working with in the bully pulpit. That, so it's kind of funny that the media blames Trump for, oh my gosh, he is, saying these things and he's doing these things, he's all over television. It's like, okay, if you want to do that, blame the 20th century. Like, Trump is just working within the office as it's come to be. So,
yeah, I mean, you and I may live to see it, Mike. Inshallah,
mhm.
like we sort of resolve some of these executive judicial conflicts, and then create the space into which Congress can walk, or something, something, something. I mean, now I'm really like vision casting and uh, tossing the knuckle bones on the table to try and see. But like as we work out the logic of this conversation, I'm thinking like, yeah, it's sort of like the debt. Whenever we talk about the debt, we're like, well, at some point, like there's going to be a come to Jesus about the debt, right?
Mhm.
It's not now, and we must hope that it's not for the next few years. Like, And yet this is bound to happen. In a similar way, it's like each moment presents its challenges. This moment is clearly the confrontation between the executive and the judicial branch. But if there is a positive resolution of those things, you can see it laying setting the stage, setting the table, to mix whatever metaphors, for the return of Congress. This has been fascinating, and thank you, Mike, for elevating our thoughts out of what would otherwise have just been an own the lib segment. Before we close, we should just touch on this element of it, which is that one thing about the No Kings protest is it was supposed, I think, to provide a contrast, and this was rather cannily done, actually, it must be said. It was supposed to provide a contrast to the military parade for the 250th anniversary of the creation of the American military, because we are 1 year out. We should always remind ourselves we're 1 year out from America's 250th birthday. But obviously, the military was created to make America, and so this is the 250th. There was this whole kind of cock and bull idea that Trump was simply declaring a military parade for his birthday, and that was to make him look even more like a dictator. And so this is all actually of a piece with the larger narrative that, like, oh yeah, this Mussolini figure is like marching soldiers through rolling tanks through the street in order to commemorate his birthday, and here are we, the plucky freedom fighters, throwing Molotov cocktails onto in Beverly Hills or something like that. But that was kind of the idea. All of this was based on a fiction, including that this was something Trump had just cooked up for his birthday. It had been in the works before he was in office. What I can't quite tell, and I'm having a hard time getting anybody to give me a straight answer about, is whether he planned it to coincide with the date of his birthday. Like, we knew that we were going to have this event this year. If our listeners know anything about whether Trump chose the date of his birthday or not, maybe they can write in. But even if he did, actually, I don't find that particularly unappealing. In fact, I would say that's sort of one of Trump's best features, is he like wants to celebrate the military on his birthday in the same way that he'll like stop on the way into the plane and like pick up the guy's hat when it blows off the top of his head. In any case, this was not what it was made out to be, but that people wanted it to be a contrast. And so now, in the wake of it, there are all these articles on like ABC, and I think Axios did one, although I may be mistaken, about how like only 250,000 people came to Trump's birthday parade, and millions of people showed up across the country to protest him. Which, first of all, like, I mean, you're looking at a nationwide protest movement and comparing it with what was never, in fact, supposed to be a massive event. If you want a really honest appraisal of both of these things, Byron York has a really good description of it. Oh, and I should say, it was Yahoo News that was making this comparison, attempt to be, yeah, exactly. I've really been wallowing in the dreck and the muck in prep for this podcast, but on Real Clear Politics, they linked to a Byron York piece called, I think that the headline was something like, "The military parade was a good thing," and we'll link to it too. But it just compares these two things. I don't know if you saw any of the footage, Mike. I didn't really. I read York's description. I guess apparently this was like a historical procession that began with older forms of the military and then kind of rolled out like World War I, World War II stuff. Sounded kind of cool, to be honest. But is there anything else about this that we should note before we?
No, I think you really touched on it. I mean, it was, to use a phrase, really trumped up. I mean, it was just kind of like this, military parade. And, I saw some of the soldiers marching. And I mean, you look at North Korea and you look at Russia, and I mean, where they're total precision. I mean, they were just kind of casually walking, really. They weren't really hardly even in formation. You have tanks kind of rolling down the street. Okay. You have, some instrumental versions of Metallica songs and Van Halen's Jump being played. I mean, this was for, kind of people to have fun, and probably people who probably, like you said, I mean, compared to nationwide protests, this was for probably people in Northern Virginia who work for the departments, who wanted to take their families to an event, over the weekend. Stephen Miller, I saw him and his wife and kid were there. So that's kind of what this was for. I mean, I read that, sight lines weren't great. Sometimes there was pretty big, gaps in between, troops and tanks coming. But, I mean, it it is what it is. It was just kind of, some, fun American kitsch. And we're trying to celebrate, obviously, the Army's, 250th birthday. And that's great. And I think they had people, marching, some of the soldiers marching in, uniforms from, say, World War II, World War One. So that's what this was all about. It was kind of like, okay, what happened if you just like took the Smithsonian, cut it in half, and opened it up and saw it as a diorama instead, and then picked it up and poured it out on the street? Like that's basically what this was. Like, just it was not like that big of a deal. But of course, like everything else, the media clowns themselves constantly. And actually, that Axios piece you referenced, and I saw this in another piece too about the parade. It's like Trump spends multi-million-dollar parade. It's like, since when are you concerned about the budget and spending? And they always trot that stuff out. It's just
So
it's like
expensive.
so grating. Yeah, it's like, oh, it's so expensive. Come
Yo,
on.
Mike, get this. As we are talking and getting ready to wrap out this episode, a tweet just showed up on formerly Twitter that literally ties everything we've been talking about together. And I guess this is actually from yesterday, but I just saw it. Spectator Index, just in, OpenAI has won a $200 million contract with the US Department of Defense. So, like, this is like every possible area of what we were just discussing: the military, the technologization of warfare, the AI of it all. We'll have to, like, perhaps save that for another
Definitely.
episode, but it's sort of an interesting fortuitous. Not that I'm scrolling X or anything, but I like to keep
Right,
abreast of
right, right.
breaking news.
None of us are doing that throughout the day. We are just 100% work.
Exactly. We never ever get on. Well, we are very lucky in that we get to be on X sometimes for our jobs. Well, this was fun. Thanks, Mike, for humoring me on a two-man show. We should probably close out with some recommendations before we bid the people farewell. Why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree. This was a lot of fun. And in terms of recommendations, I would say I've been listening, especially since Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, since his passing. If you haven't, please read Michael Anton's essay about their album Smile, that came out. I think it was in the CRB in like 2012, but it's fantastic. It's a great essay. So I've actually just been listening to a lot of Beach Boys albums, not only like, the greatest hits, which a lot of people have those, but actually the albums straight through. It's amazing. Some even the early albums. I mean, Pet Sounds is, I think they came out in 1966. I think that's, a very famous one. But even some of their early ones, just, fun surf music, Surfing USA. I think that came out in 1963. And they're just, it's phenomenal. Like, I think of like the rock band, the Eagles, and they're kind of, I guess it's like a 7-part harmony. And you wonder, where'd they get that from? And then you listen to the Beach Boys and it's like, okay, now I get where they got that from. They're out in California too, Southern California. So you understand kind of how, bands kind of see what the previous band did and then build on that and build on up. There's actually a funny story too about Brian Wilson, where I think Don Henley, the Eagles, ran into him. And I think he had written something out where, the Eagles, basically saying the Eagles have done some great songs and etc. And he gave this thing to Brian Wilson to sign. And Wilson signed it, but then he struck out great and just said good.
Oh,
So
yikes!
he was an interesting character for sure. I mean, the guy was, arguably, I would say, a genius. I mean, you listen to his music, you listen to especially what some, his colleagues and peers said about him, John Lennon, Paul McCartney. I mean, Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles, that album basically was created in response to Pet Sounds.
I did
So,
not know that.
yeah. So, I mean, but yeah, the Beach Boys, I mean, it's just kind of amazing just listening to them, what they did for their time. And I've been really enjoying that.
That's awesome. The piece that Anton wrote is reprinted right at the American Mind, so people can
Yes.
go and find it there as well as on CRB. I think it's still out in front of the paywall at the CRB site, although that may be undone soon. Yeah, there's so much artistry in those that I remember listening to the Beach Boys for the first time when I was like, I guess I must have been 7 or so, and we were traveling to California because we had lived in England up until that point. We wanted to move back to the States and we decided we wanted to go to California. So we went out to like scope out different cities in California and just traveling on the 101, listening to some of those classic tracks was formative experience. And fun fact, I then went to elementary school with the kid of one of the Beach Boys, and I've never been able to remember which one because he was sort of like a later addition. But anyway, I have like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon with the Beach Boys. All right, it is finally time. I've been chomping at the bit, but I keep having other things to recommend that get in the way. It is finally time for me to recommend the Roundtable's first ever video game. We're all gamers, actually. I think everyone on this podcast has played video games, but we've never really let the nerd flag fly. And there's a reason for that, which will explain my recommendation. And that is, you can disagree with me, Mike, but I think that video games have really passed me by in the main. In general, video games these days, for the kids these days, are all made for people who are so thoroughly brain rotted by the internet that they need either constant stimulation or interminable hours of play. So you get two different major kinds of games that tend to come out. One of them is the Elder Scrolls model, which is the MMORPG, the massive online RPG, or just massive RPGs generally, even if they're not multiplayer and they're not online. These open world, huge, even like self-generating sometimes maps, where like there is a story, but it threads through just this endless expanse of space. And the point is that you have these like interminable sort of decision tree conversations with NPC villagers, and you get a million side quests. It's just like, I have a job, bro, like, and a life, and I cannot play that. I can't play those games. I also can't play like the Fortnite of it all, where you just get on there to be completely one-shotted by some 12-year-old that's like probably hyped up on Adderall and For Loco or something. Anyway, like these are these like rapid response sandbox games where you're building things in real time and you're fighting whatever. Basically, what I'm saying is I'm old and lame, and I'm not very good at either of these kinds of games. And the game that has gotten lost in the shuffle that used to be kind of the core of the industry, the classic. Well, there's a few different ones. One of them is the classic old school platformer. And that's like, if you played Super Mario on Super Nintendo or Mega Man X or whatever, the jumping around, the shooting, the fighting. The other is the like highly sophisticated but linear 3D kind of fighting or shooting platformer. I'm thinking of like Ninja Gaiden, God of War, Gears of War. That's kind of, they don't make good ones of those anymore. And then the other one is the JRPG, the Japanese role-playing game, which is the turn-based fighting. There is kind of a map, but it's not infinite, and you move around and you do side quests and you power up your character. But ultimately, there is like a grand adventure story behind the whole thing. And that is the game that has just been beautifully and finally recreated in Expedition 33 Clair Obscur. I don't always love turn-based fighting because I kind of want to duke it out in real time. But what they've done with Clair Obscur is they've put in this like real-time defense mechanic where you can parry attacks as they come. And if you hit it at the right moment, you get this incredibly satisfying counterattack. So that's the gameplay, which is instantly addictive. But then the story is also really, really good, and the visuals are beautiful. So if you have any interest in video games at all, it's been years and years and years since I had a video game that I could just say with my whole heart, spend whatever. I think it's $50 new, but I'm sure you can get it used now for less than that. Get yourself and or the kids in your life Expedition 33. It's kind of an older game, so don't get it for like your toddler or whatever. But like high schoolers can play it with great enjoyment, and so can adults. I think I beat it in a total of like 30 hours, and then there's a ton of replay value. 30 hours, is, if you think about it, play like for an hour a day for a couple weeks, get done with it. Just an immersive, beautiful, artistic, gorgeous experience. Can't rate it highly enough. Hope it wins Game of the Year in every possible outlet. Go play Expedition 33. All right. That's all the time we have, I think. I finally got to sing the praises of Expedition 33. And we've got Beach Boys. We will drop links to everything in the show notes. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about everything we do, you can visit our websites at AmericanMind.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Ryan will be back next week, and we will probably also have a guest or two to talk more about basically everything we discussed this time around and whatever else may have happened in the intervening week that feels like 10 years. So don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you never miss an episode. It really helps us in particular if you give us 5 stars wherever you're currently listening. The other way that you can help support the work that we do is by donating at claremont.org/donate. We greatly appreciate donations, large and small. And if you want to throw in a little note saying, please shout me out on the podcast, we will for any donation amount, but you can also remain anonymous, of course. Thanks very much to our production and engineering crew, the brothers G, Jake, and Ryan Gannon. And thanks especially to all of you for listening. We will talk to you next week.